Hi guys, welcome to the very first sketch support video. I am super excited to roll out this video series. It's going to be a continuation of the Sketch Week series that I've been doing on my blog and social media. If you're new to this concept, what I do is I take one sketch and then create multiple layout examples based on that sketch, with each layout looking completely different. The reason I do this is to show what a valuable tool sketches can be and how easy it is to adapt them to fit your specific needs. If you struggle with layout design, you're looking to save some time, or if you're just lacking inspiration, a sketch can be very helpful. You can follow a sketch exactly as they are, or you can make changes to better fit your style, your photos, your theme, maybe even a specific piece of paper that you want to use. I always say that sketches are not a rule that you have to follow. They are simply a starting point to build on. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the sketch that I'm going to be using in this video. The sketch I've used for this video is going to be a one-page sketch. If you're a two-page scrapbooker, don't turn this video off. I always show how you can take a one-page sketch and turn it into a two-page layout. You might be a little surprised at how easy it is to actually do that. I never, ever, ever let the type of sketch determine the type of layout that I will create. You can use any size sketch for any size of layout that you want. So I've included a link below to download this free sketch, and if you enjoy using this sketch, be sure to check out all of the downloadable sketches we have at scrapbookgeneration.com. There are tons. I will include a link below to those as well, just in case you want to check those out. If you have never used one of my Scrapbook Generation sketches, I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain about how they are set up. I try to make these sketches as easy to use as possible. So I include some helpful information next to the sketch so that you don't have to try to guess how to put a layout together just by looking at this picture here of a layout. To the right of the sketch, the first bit of information includes measurements of every piece on the sketch. So for this sketch in particular, that means the size of the hexagons, the photo mats, the journaling strips, and then the stars. The next section includes the placements. This is to help with the placements of the elements on the sketch. Now, that doesn't mean that every piece of the layout is going to have a placement direction. Some placements you can easily figure out without needing extra information. So for example, in this sketch, there are no placement directions for the hexagons because you can clearly see they are on the edges of the sketch and you don't need a placement measurement for that. What the placement directions do tell you on this sketch is that these middle elements are centered within the hexagon frame. The last section of information includes variations. On my one-page sketches, I will give you different ideas for changing up the sketch. The information varies depending on the sketch, but they most often include options for changing the photos, adding backgrounds, maybe some extra pieces, or changing certain elements. So now that we've gone over the sketch, let's go ahead and move on to the first layout that I have created based on this sketch. For this first layout, I stayed pretty close to the sketch for two different reasons. Number one, I love hexagons. If you give me paper and a hexagon punch, I am a very, very, very happy girl. Number two, I wanted to first show you how I arranged my hexagons and how you can adapt them to fit different sizes. I ended up using a punch that was slightly smaller than the hexagons on the sketch, so I had to make a few adjustments to make that work. The main reason I used a smaller punch had to do with my paper choices. This boy collection from My Mind's Eye is one of my all-time favorite collections. I've used it so much that I was down to just these teeny tiny little scraps left from a 6x6 paper pad. I couldn't use some of the papers that I really wanted to use if I went with the hexagon size on the sketch. So I made the choice to go with a slightly smaller hexagon. So first things first, let's look at how I added the hexagons to my cardstock base. On the sketch, there are 10 hexagons that fit between the top and bottom of the cardstock base. Because I ended up using a smaller hexagon, I had to use 12 to fill that same space. I started by placing my hexagons on the right side of my layout first. I didn't adhere them yet. I just wanted to figure out my spacing between the hexagons, and then also where exactly I needed those hexagons to be in order for there to be balance between all sides of the layout. Next, I added the 2 rows along the top of the cardstock base with the same general spacing between the hexagons as I have between the hexagons on the side. And again, these are not adhered yet. So looking at this photo, you can see that the position the hexagons are in is not going to create a balanced look on the cardstock base. What I mean by that is that I want the hexagons going down the sides to be a mirror of each other. I want the left side column to be positioned exactly as the right side, and the same for the top and bottom too. Now I can see that to have balance, I need the starting column, that first column of hexagons on both the left and right side, to be a half piece of a hexagon. To achieve this, all I had to do was shift the hexagons to the right. With that balance of hexagons figured out, now I can actually start adhering them to the cardstock base. To make things really easy, I cut the hexagons in half for the sides and used one piece on the left side and then the other piece on the right side. If you look at the bottom left piece and the top right piece, they are the same color pattern. I flipped the order of the colors so that I could use each piece. So you can use this same method to adapt the design to whatever size of hexagon you want to use. If you want to go larger or you want to go smaller, this method will help you create balance on this cardstock base. Once you have this first frame of hexagons up, the rest are incredibly easy to fill in. When it comes to the spacing between the hexagons, I just eyeball this. I'm not going to take the time to measure when you're never going to notice if the space between these 2 hexagons is slightly larger than the space between these 2 hexagons. I decided I wanted to follow the sketch and add some hand-stitched hexagons. To add these, I used a punched hexagon that is the same size as all of the other hexagons on my layout. I placed it where I wanted my stitching to go and then traced around it with a pencil. I also used an even smaller hexagon punch to add a penciled border on top of some of the hexagons. Now, not to get too far off subject, I've got kind of a quick little stitching tip to share with you. When stitching around a shape like a hexagon where you have points and corners with equal sides, I will pierce my holes in the corners or points first and then use the same amount of holes on each side. I know that sounds very obvious that you would want the same amount of holes on each side, but sometimes it's hard, especially if you are new to stitching, to gauge the distance between your holes in order for you to land on a corner or a point and still have that equal spacing. It's just an easy little trick to ensure that you always end up with a hole perfectly positioned in those corners. Speaking of stitching, if you're new to stitching, be sure to check out my hand stitching tutorial. I'll link to it below. Now that we've gone over how to balance and apply all of those hexagon elements, let's get to the change I made to the sketch to fit what I was working with. The biggest change I made was applied to the photos. The sketch has 2 3x4-inch photos, but I switched those out for 3 2.5 by 3.5 wallet size photos. Anytime you are using a sketch and want to change up the photos, maybe you want to use more or maybe you want to use less, as long as you are filling generally the same space, anything will work. In this case, the sketch has a combined width of photos that is 6 inches. And I know they're slightly overlapped, so it's not going to be exactly 6 inches. Now the combined width of the photos that I used is 7.5 inches. So that's a difference of 1.5 inches. Most likely 1.5 inches change isn't enough to need any major adjustments to your layout. A big plus to this sketch is that you have a lot of room to adapt your photos to fit what you want to use. I think as long as you stay within the frame of the hexagons, you can add as many of or as less of photos you want. Since the change in the photos didn't require any other adjustments on the layout, my title stayed in the same place below the photos as it is on the sketch, and then the same goes for the journaling strips above the photos. While this layout didn't have a lot of changes, the next one does. You can clearly see with layout number 2 that it uses the same sketch, but it looks completely different. The first change I made was adding a background piece. Instead of creating the frame of embellishments around the 12 by 12 base paper, I decided I wanted to slightly shrink down my cardstock base and instead use a pattern paper as the 12 by 12 inch base. Adding a background is always an easy adjustment to make to a sketch, and it can make a drastic change to the look of your layout with minimal effort. My personal reason for adding the background to my layout is to give a little pop to the neutral color scheme that I used. I love that neutral doesn't have to mean boring or subtle. Sometimes neutrals can be just as eye-catching as bright colors. I think that the 12 by 12 wood pattern paper helped me achieve that. I also really liked that the wood paper coordinated with the wood fence in the background of my photo. The second change I made was to the frame design. Instead of using the hexagons on the sketch, I used a lot of different elements. Those hexagons can be switched out for any shape or design that you want. You can go with more straight line shapes to match the arrangement of the hexagons. Some good options for that might be squares, triangles, rectangles, or diamonds. You can also do what I did and use a collection of one shape used in many different forms and sizes. You can use any shape, any design. Some good ideas for that include stars, hearts, arrows, circles, or flowers would be really pretty too. Another option is to go with theme-specific pieces. Things like snowflakes, Easter eggs, pumpkins, Christmas ornaments. Confetti would be a good one for like a birthday layout, or paw prints for a dog page. Another option is to mix up many different elements. For example, on my layout, I used camera die cuts, wooden cameras, some puffy heart stickers, along with some wooden hearts. And then I have these paper rings on here that are actually the lenses from the die cuts. And then I have some glitter circles, watercolor circles, and then Nuvo drops. There are endless ways you can play around with the design of the framing. The third change I made was, once again, to the photos. This time I replaced the two 3x4 inch photos with a 4x6 inch photo. I mentioned already that you can pretty much do whatever you want with your photos as long as you stay within the frame of the embellishments. The main thing to look at keeping constant with this sketch is that those center elements, the photos, the title, the journaling, all stay centered inside the embellishment frame. Because I'm now using a photo that is 2 inches taller than the original photos and 2 inches smaller on the width from the originals, I had to make some adjustments to ensure that everything stayed centered. So I placed the photo on the right, The title has stayed in the same general area below the photo. I did have to shift it slightly to the right. I'm looking to have the same space from middle elements to frame on both the left and right side. If you look at my photo, there is equal space on the left side to frame, top side to frame, and bottom side to frame. And the title is placed so that the far right E is roughly the same space to frame as the photo is. To keep everything grouped together and to create a balance between all the middle elements, I added my journaling strips to the right of the photo above the title. This layout is a good example of how you can really change things up in the center of the frame. You could use 2 3x5 inch photos or 2 4x4 inch photos arranged like they are on the sketch, or you could create a block of photos like 4 3x3 inch photos or 9 2x2 inch photos. You can also adjust the size of your framing and adjust your middle elements to fit. So you can go with a bigger frame, which is going to make the area inside the frame smaller, and then use smaller photos or less photos to go with it. You can use a smaller frame, which is going to make the area inside the frame bigger, and then you can use larger photos or more photos. Tiny little adjustments like that can make a big difference. Let's go on to layout number 3. This layout falls into the category of let's experiment and just see where this goes. The first change I made was adding the background piece and bringing my frame in a little, just like I did on the last layout. Since I used such a bright and colorful paper for my frame, I wanted to provide a break to all of that with a simple white border. So I used a 12 by 12 inch piece of white cardstock for the base, and then cut the triangle pattern paper down to an 11 by 11 inch square. To me, this helped keep the colors and pattern from being too much or too overwhelming. The second change was made to the photos. I happened to notice that where I get my photos printed, that they had square photo print options all the way up to 8 by 8 inches. And just kind of on a whim, I thought, why not? And got one printed. It was sitting on top of my photo storage box that I have on my table that I scrapbook on, and it hit me that it might be kind of cool if I used it with this sketch and created a frame around it. So I'm looking through my papers trying to figure out what I want to use with this picture, and I come across this fun colorful triangle paper and got the idea to cut around the pattern and lay it over the top of the photo. So I had no idea if the image I had in my head of what I wanted this to look like was actually going to be the end result of what I got, but I was definitely up for the challenge. So to start creating this overlay frame, I first used a ruler and pencil to draw the lines of where the photo would be in the center. This is so I can see where the photo would go and plan the cuts I would make along the triangles without going beyond the edge of the photo. I wanted the photo to be the only thing showing inside the frame. Next, I used a pencil to draw around the edges of the triangles to create the cutout frame. I could have just started cutting, but I wanted to get a visual of what the frame would look like before I started cutting, because there's no turning back once you break out the scissors. Once I was satisfied with the frame, I went back over the pencil lines just to make sure that those lines were clear so I didn't make any mistakes as I cut. I used my scissors for most of the cutting and felt like it was fairly easy to cut along the triangle design. There were a few spots that I used an X-Acto knife. I cut out a few individual triangles and felt like it was easy to cut out with the X-Acto knife. It would have been pretty difficult to do that with scissors. So after I had the middle cut out, I erased all the pencil lines. To help the frame stand out, I used a nail file to sand and distress the edges and expose that white core of the paper. The third change I made was embellishing the frame, and I took more of a simple approach to it. Because this paper is so bold, I really didn't want to do a whole lot of extra to it. I wanted to keep things pretty simple. A few things I did was adding a stitch border to some of the triangles. Some I stitched on the lines of the triangle, and some I stitched inside the lines of the triangle. I also cut out a few triangles, sanded the edges, and then used foam adhesive to adhere them on top of another triangle in the pattern. I really liked the dimension that it adds to those pieces. I used a Wink of Stella glimmer brush to add a sparkle to some of the triangles. It's a pretty subtle glimmer. I just thought it would kind of add an interesting element to that colorful background. And the last embellishment I added were tiny punched hearts to the center of some of the triangles. The last adjustment I made on this layout is moving the title and journaling. The journaling more so than the title. Since my photo is taking up the whole center of the layout, I had to make a few adjustments. So I moved the title to the right side of the photo. It's still in the same general area below the photo as it is on the sketch. So my title was built around the giant smile word, and I had to make sure that the L wasn't covering up Drew's face. So I had to kind of shift everything over a little bit. The journaling I moved to the upper left portion of the photo. I couldn't put my journaling as it is on the sketch because I didn't want it sitting right on top of Drew's head. When I had this photo printed, I had imagined using this empty space in the photo for embellishments or a title or journaling, so this actually worked out perfectly to go ahead and put my journaling there. Using the empty space in a photo is a great spot for creating a backdrop for other elements on your layout. So that brings us to the last layout of this video. I always like to save the one that is furthest from the sketch for last. There is no rule that says your layout has to look anything like the sketch, and my next layout certainly doesn't. Let's have a look. I mentioned earlier that I always like to show how you can use a one-page sketch to create a two-page layout. I have two different methods that I will use to go from a one-page sketch to a two-page layout. The first is to stretch the sketch. Imagine that you are grabbing a hold of the right side of a sketch and stretching it across your layout. That means if you have a background piece, you are making it longer to fit across the two pages. The second is to extend the sketch. This means that you are repeating elements to extend the sketch across a wider base. So, for example, if there are vertical background strips on a sketch, you are adding more strips to extend the design across two pages. The first change I made, aside from extending the sketch, is removing part of that embellishment frame. As you can see on the left and right side of my layout, there is no frame. I knew right away that I wanted to use arrows for my embellishment framing. The main factor that came into play as reasoning for removing the left and right side frames, I love basing my designs off of the theme of my layout, and I wanted these arrows to help support my story and my photos. So I only wanted arrows to be going in the up or down position, since that is the direction and the theme of my layout. So I used a wide variety of arrows. There are strips of pattern paper with an arrow point that are going all the way across the top and the bottom of the layout. Then I added in some die cut arrows that I cut on my silhouette, and then some arrow strips cut from an Arrow design pattern paper. To add a little bit more decoration and detail, I mixed in some word stickers, enamel dots, and then these tiny little metallic stars. The second change I made was adding more photos. Lots more photos. The beauty of creating two-page layouts is you have so much more room for photos. And if you're anything like me, you are overrun with photos from every little event in your life. So because I removed the left and right frame of embellishments, this gave me the opportunity to extend the photos to fit all the way across the layout. Now, if you want to keep the left and right frame of embellishments, you would just remove the far left and the far right photo to allow room for that framing. The next change I made was to the placement of the title. I knew that to have balance in these middle elements, my title was going to need to overlap onto my photos. So looking at my photos, I had to find a grouping that had some empty space in either the top portion of the photos or the bottom portion of the photos. I had two options. I have a group of photos with empty space at the bottom, and then I have a group of photos with empty space at the top. I opted to go with the top because the light blue sky in the photos helps my darker title stand out. If I had gone with the bottom, my dark title would have been lost in the dark trampoline in my photos. So paying attention to details like that can make a big difference in the overall appeal of your layout design. The last change I made was the format of my journaling. I switched the journaling strips on the sketch for a journaling block. I will typically use journaling strips when I'm trying to fit and form my journaling around elements on my layout. I might need to wrap them around photos or subjects in the photo or certain papers or embellishments. So since I had a straight line of photos, I didn't need to do that. So I opted to go with the journaling block instead. Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't use journaling strips if you wanted to. You can still use them along a straight edge if you want. A lot of times when I have a straight line of photos like this, I like to create a journaling block and add it up against the edge of the photos. I like to use a corner rounder to round the two edges furthest away from the photos. So with this layout, it was the top two corners. Then I adhere the flat side to the edge of the photos, and this makes it look like it's coming out from behind the photos, kind of like a little tap. So with that detail, that brings us to the end of sketch support for this month. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check back for next month's sketch support video, where I'll take another new sketch, share more layout examples based on that sketch, and show you that you can always adapt a sketch to fit what you need.